Welcome back to Bunters Yard, and today we are looking at paint chipping techniques and products. And just to keep the comparisons as close as we can, we'll be using these bridge sections from the new Bunters Yard layout. So we're looking at three different products. The first one is this vallejo chipping medium. This is it's got a black cap, so we can use it straight from the bottle if we choose to, which makes it very simple. Old Faithful coming up next is Hairspray. We've used this before in some videos, but we're going to go over that again. Just need to point out that other brands of Hairspray are available. And then finally, salt chipping. This is quite a chunky crystal. You could use different sort of you can use grinders and stuff to make them finer if that's what you choose. So just as a disclaimer at this point, this isn't an ultimate how to paint chip type guide. This really is just showing the comparison between the three different products and a couple of techniques with each. And when we get to the end of the video, we'll show all six results, and then you can choose the one that's closest to the effect you're after, and then maybe you can use that as the basis as your sort of experiment and practice as you go forward. And you know, if you choose to just use a different brand of paint as your top coat, or if you put on more coats, or maybe leave it to dry longer, or use a stiffer brush to get the chippy effect going, the final effect will be different. So just want to point that out at this point, is that this is not necessarily the end result that you're going to get. It's just a base from you to start from. So having said that, let's get on with the comparison, and let's make a start. So I've marked the back of each of these pieces just so that I remember which product we've used on each: Hairspray, chipping medium and salt. It was quite obvious at the end which is which, but just in case I had a moment and then forgot which was which. So using a black surface primer. This is a vallejo primer, and they just got one coat each, and I was allowed to dry for about 2 hours in this particular case. This just gives it a good surface for the next layers of paint to key into. It just gives it a fair comparison. Depends on what you're modelling. You may not need to do this stage at all, or even the next, but it was just in keeping with the look of this piece. So we've used three different sort of shades of brown, just to add like a base rust effect that we're going to add chipping products over. So all three sections were done in a very similar way. So just a couple of different colours of rust, and there's an orange, very bright going on there. Generally, if you're chipping, you would need to do the sort of under layers quite a bit brighter, I find, because a lot of it doesn't show through as brightly because you're only having small chips and patches. So then everything was covered in a satin lacquer. This particular one is a brand used for painting guitars, but it doesn't really matter what it is. And then we let that dry. Having said that, the first part we didn't let dry. So the first piece of the chipping for the salt, we need the salt to bond to the piece that we're actually working on. So while the lacquer was still tacky, I started putting the salt on. Now I'm doing half of this, and I'll show you why in a moment. But you would need to, with the salt chipping, you need to put the salt kind of where you think the chips are going to be, because the salt, the idea is that the salt will mask the top coat colour, and then eventually all you do is you just brush the salt off or wash it off, and it reveals the colour below it. So you need to have a bit of forethought here and just kind of think where you want your chips to appear. So on the other side, traditional way of doing this is to wet it and then add the salt on after. And then as the water dries, then the salt will bond to the piece of the model that you're working on. Now some of the salt will dissolve, as I'm sure you're aware, but it is flexible because you can move the salt around, you can push it around until you get it kind of where you want it to be. Then you just need to let the water dry completely, and then the salt, to a degree, will be sort of stuck to your model. Now with the hairspray, we are going to give it a single coat all over, and we let that dry for sort of 10 minutes or so. And then on the other side, on the left, we're going to give it a second coat, much thicker coat. Then with the chipping medium, now this is a vallejo one. Because it's got the black cap, it suggests to me that this is ready to use straight out of the bottle, which you certainly can. But if you look, it's quite thick. So you need to make sure that your air pressure is up on your airbrush. We used about 20 psi, maybe a little bit more. And you can see that as you spray it, you'll see in a minute, it kind of splatters out. So it doesn't come out in an even coat like paint would. You can see it coming out in sort of, like a splatter pattern. But that's the idea. That's how it should be. Now on this side, we've thinned it down. We've used thinners. It's about 50-50, and it comes out a bit finer. So got a slightly better coverage, and we're just going to see the difference when we get to the end of what that's actually like. And then each of the pieces is then treated to this is again a vallejo colour, and we're just going to give a single coat of this. Now if you choose to have panels that have got patches on, it's going to be slightly different. Your chipping technique will be different, and the way these things react are different. So just bear that in mind. Now with the salt, when we cover this, we need to be quite careful, because the salt will readily blow away, as you can see. It's not quite completely dry on the left hand side. I maybe should have left it a little bit longer, so possibly a little bit unfair. But I've given it a light gentle coat. This just helps to bond the salt in a little bit. But this is part of the charm of this, way the salt will sort of blow away, and it gives you this random effect. So to remove the salt, all we need to do is just using a brush, is just basically just going to knock the salt off. And because the salt has sort of shielded the model from that top coat of paint, it just leaves that sort of rusty patch. And different grade of salt, if you use a finer salt, you're obviously going to get finer rust chips, as you can see there. Some of them are much smaller than the others. That may be the factory after it is. Then you could use a sort of salt grinder and then make it smaller. If you're working on a large model, you may want large chips. So horses for courses, as they say. And then on the other side, this is the side that where the salt chips were bonded on with water, and there's a bit more movement, and where it's dissolved a little bit, the patches are slightly bigger, so it's a slightly different effect. Again, if you use smaller grinds of salt, then the effect will be different again. So here's the part with the where we use the chipping medium, and this is the side where it's straight out of the bottle, so it comes out in more of a sort of splattery effect rather than a full coat. So you just need to wet it with water, let it sort of soak in for a minute or two, and then just with a soft brush we're just going to brush it back. And what happens is that the paint gets wet, it permeates to the chipping medium underneath, and then the chipping medium then releases itself from the from the colours below. Gives us this nice chip effect. So this is quite a fine effect, which is possibly what you're after. Depends again on the scale of the model you're working on. But this is quite a nice chip effect. I like this one. Now once you've got the chipping started, the more aggressive you become with your brush, the paint will then still begin to lift. It won't rely solely on the chipping medium, but if you just go across it quite gently, you'll just lift the part where where the chipping medium has settled. So on the second side, this is the side where we thinned down the chipping medium, so it would have covered give a better coverage. So it should, in theory, release a lot more of the top paint, which it does. You can see, so it comes off in bigger lumps, and a different effect again, but using the same medium, just thinned down with thinners. You can use water thinners down, by the way. Don't need to thin it with thinners. Now, just as a sort of a word here, if you was to maybe paint one of the panels in a slightly different shade, as if it's been maybe repaired, the top paint would be thicker. It would be twice as thick. So then the action of the chipping would work differently, and you get a different effect. So just beware of that. And if you're going to do that on a model of yours, then do practice before on just a piece of scrap or a piece of plastic, and then you'll get an idea of how it's going to react when it gets onto your model. And then finally onto our hairspray medium. So this is the side that's had just a single coat of hairspray, and that, again, remember that different hairsprays will work in a different way. This is a firm hold. I'm not sure if the Asda medium hold would work in a different. I guess it would. So you would need to experiment and practice on pieces of scrap or piece of plastic, just to get an idea of how it's going to react. Now, it's taken a while to come off. There we go, that's better. So this is quite a aggressive sort of I'm an attack on this, so that's why it's having this sort of scratchy mark. If I leave it to soak more, it may react slightly differently, but it's quite tough to get off. It's not normally like this with others, or certainly if you use more hairspray, as you'll see in a minute. But this may be a style that you like, I'm not sure. Incidentally, the music we're listening to is a song called Rusty Bucket. I thought it was appropriate for this as the backing track for this video. So we got from Epidemic Music, so we get Epidemic Music for all of our videos currently. So lots and lots of choice in there. So Rusty Bucket. So I'll try and match the music to the video. Doesn't always work, but that's what we're listening to today. Rusty Bucket. So if we move on to the other side, on the left hand side, this is where I've had 2 coats of hairspray. So this should release it a lot more readily than it did on the right hand side in version 1. Now we can see we're using a softer brush to start with here, and it's coming off much easier. and given a kind of different effect. So on the right hand side you see it's more sort of scratchy, and on this side it's coming off in a slightly different way. So all the raised detail is releasing first, which is kind of a thing you're going to be after. It's quite a desired effect. So if you want lots and lots of your paint removed, this is a great technique. Just 2 or 3 coats of hairspray, let it dry in between each coat, but you can see that it releases lots and lots. So that panel there is particularly good. So just as a final touch to these, we've added in just very quickly some rust streaks using the MIG oil brushes. So we're just touching some of the lighter rust colour in, just to give us an idea what it might look like once we've got rust streaks in place. It will make a difference to the final effect. So we'll use another dry brush just to create that streaky effect. Then we add a second colour, which is dark rust, and that's normally in the centre of the rust spot. Again, I'm just going to brush it down out of the way, just to give us a little streaky effect. So there's our first finished piece, which is the salt. So on the right hand side, the salt's been bonded onto the piece using the lacquer, and on the left we've used just plain old water and let it dry to hold it in place. But quite an obvious effect. Now on this one we have used our hairspray. So on the right, the hairspray was just a single layer, and then a second coat was added to the left hand side, and that's allowed it to release much more of the top paint. And then finally the chipping effect. So the chipping medium on the right hand side was just used straight from the bottle, and on the left it was thinned down to create a more even coat. So that's it. Hope that's been of use, giving an idea of maybe which way you might want to try, and we'll be doing some more videos in future, a little bit more in depth. We'll speak soon.